The Saga of ShaHaNon, Book 2, Emperors and Exiles, Chapter 1, Guests, Part 2.
Go,
She said.
it will be well worth it for you.
He wanted to argue, but for whatever reason, he grabbed up his cloak and pulled it on. He took the heavy axe from the wall and belted it on about his waist. The storm was uneasy tonight, and he was not going to be unarmed. Without a word, he crossed his yard, pushed the gate open, and stepped out into the wind and bitter cold. His cold pit was not far, just down the wall of his yard and several long strides along the side of the hill he had built into. The door was heavy timber, bolted with a lock not even a troll could undo. He heaved it open, fighting the wind and the weight of the thing. Steep steps ran back and down into the hill. The ground was reinforced only as deep as the thaw went. Once beyond the thaw depth, the permafrost held it cold and solid year-round. He entered the long chamber where he hung his meat store. Once hung inside, meat or anything else stayed frozen, until he pulled it out. There was one caribou cow left before his stores were gone. He unhooked it with a prayer that he was doing the right thing, and packed it back out. It took him all summer to fill this storeroom, and this winter had been long and bitter. This was the last of it. If he was wrong, he might have to kill one of his sheep to make it until the herds and flocks returned in the spring. At the door he paused. There was thunder in that storm. He could feel the ground under his feet shudder in objection to it. The storm was no natural thing, and he knew it. No axe or sword would fight the evil in the darkness tonight. He shouldered the last of his meat and headed back to his yard. As he gripped the heavy bone handle of the gate, he felt Grunda rumble and shudder off mountains of ice, angry at the intrusion of magic and darkness into her realm. She was 100 miles away, yet like all things of such power in his ear. Ivan felt it, as if the ground itself whispered to him. He shoved his gate open and dropped the carcass to pull it closed. He left the frozen meat to lift the great poles that lined the walls of his yard. 25 tall poles, each hauled in from the distant river, Uta, were tucked down along the wall's interior. In time of need for extra shelter or for company, they could be pulled out and set into the holes carved for them around the fire pit. On their tops, they were attached to a great sewn tarp of hides that would make a roof over the entire space, except for the center, where the fire pit smoke could escape. He had to kick away at snow, ice, and grass bedding to find each hole, then heave the massive posts upward. It was hard work, but he saw to it in silence and couldn't help but be a little proud of how well the tarp went up and how neatly it stretched out and created a whole new space. This was an ancient design and held magics in it when done correctly. Once that chore was complete, he set up the spit and drove the frozen animal onto it. Tasks done, he dropped down into the grass bed he had laid for the sheep. Via settled down next to him and put her head in his lap. The old woman sat by the fire with her head dropping forward as she fell in and out of sleep. By the time the meat had begun to cook, filling the space with the aroma of a feast, the storm had begun to spit shards of ice. Thunder growled far too close. Ivan looked up through the tarp's opening, and as he watched, he could see the darkness in the storm swirl and reach out, seeking something. He had seen such storms before, and he had been part of what it was after. Today he didn't think it was so, but he prayed the magics he had laid on his little home, as dictated by the ways of old, would hold, and he would remain unknown. Wind gusted around, threatening his tarps and poles, causing the sheep to wake into uneasiness and bunch up closer. Via sat up and watched the gate to the yard. The door shuddered a moment in the wind. Ivan sighed. It had been so long since he had spoken to anyone, so long since he had been in a crowd, so long since he had thought of people. He was half afraid the woman was right, and he would have company. He had come here to hide, to mourn, and to try to hear the gods. He stroked the head of the dog.
"Was it a waste of time, Via?"
he asked her. She just leaned against his leg. He put his hand on her head, closing his eyes, letting the cold gust and blow against his face. His heart ached. His only friends in the world were people he would never see again. They were people who didn't even know who he was, who would never look for him. The memory of them had been nearly wiped away, but not even ShaHaNon could get past the powers of Azir. Ivan had awakened in Ramdell with a story of him being on a drunken rampage, and yet his heart knew better. Then the magics had slipped, and it had all come back to him. He wasn't positive that the others had also been spelled, but it was likely. The chance they would ever have the magic fail, if they had been spelled, was slim. It would be to them as if it had never happened. Ivan opened his eyes when Via sat up. She made a soft woof in warning to Ivan. A moment before a man pushed in through the gate. He was snow-plastered, the storm outside the walls terrible. He stumbled into the light and warmth of the yard. He caught his breath as he pulled his hood back from his face. His blond beard was as snow-plastered as his furs. He blinked in the light, slowly seeing Ivan.
Who are you?
He asked, clearly not sure if Ivan was even real.
I am called Ivan. Who are you?
I am Udhardrik,
He said.
son of Bull and line of Kenar.
He took a step forward.
Is this your fire?
Yes.
There are others.
He gestured back.
Might we shelter here?
Ivan wanted to laugh at the young man's attempt to remember the words, though clearly he had forgotten them. He struggled to do his best. Ivan sighed.
By the laws of Azir,
He gestured to the fire.
the fire is hot, the walls hold.
I'll go get the others.
The man-boy turned as he spoke and ran out the gate for his companions.
So it begins.
The old woman said sagely. Ivan looked over at the crazy old woman who stood in the door of the hut as if she owned the place and he was just there to honor her.
Who are they?
Ivan asked her, trying not to grumble about her apparent sense of ownership of his yard and home. She turned her blind eyes to look at Ivan. He tried not to flinch from the look, or from the knowledge of the great pain caused by the magics that had blasted her eyes. He had been in Jerome's prisons more than once, and he had heard the screams of those who suffered such torture. He thanked his gods that he had not been blinded that way.
You shall see.
She said. She turned her face to the sky, her blind eyes shut. Ivan didn't argue. He just waited. He shifted and draped his great arm around his dog. His mind wandered back to fires and cold nights that seemed almost to be dreams now. He thought of the faces and voices he so missed. If it was they who came, he would welcome them, but otherwise company was undesired. He sighed heavily.
You shall see them again.
The old woman said, moving to Ivan's side. Afraid she might fall into the fire, he moved quickly to offer his hand to help guide her. She chuckled softly.
Worry for me, do you?
It would not do to have you fall into the fire.
He said a bit gruffly.
Even a blind woman can feel the heat of the fire and know how close to get or not.
The gate swung open, ripped out of the hands of the man who was opening it. Behind him hurried an entire group. The storm outside was black and chill in a way that made Ivan rise to his feet. He had never thought he would feel such a cold in his ear. Via growled low and softly, her hair standing up. Ivan ignored his guests as he moved to the gate. In the darkness, he could almost hear the screaming wind of the great storm that he had nearly been caught in once, as it howled through mountain passes, seeking the souls of those who were out in it. He grabbed the gate, in defiance of the storm and its evil. With a snarl, he slammed it closed. The icy chill dropped away and left them in an oddly peaceful calm. His magics held. The group that had arrived were all storm-blasted, pulling scarves off their faces as they gathered about the fire. In the mix of it all, several men knelt about a child. They were tearing off his half-frozen clothes to get the heat of the fire to the cold skin. Ivan circled about them, watching the concern and fear in their faces. It had been so long since he had been with other people, and longer since he had seen the faces of his own people, that he had forgotten how grand and powerful they looked. Ivan was a bit shocked when he saw that the child they were all so worried about was not even an Aziran child. He was an adolescent Purton. He had clearly fallen through ice somewhere and gotten soaked to the skin. Ivan watched the men rub at the young man, trying to warm his skin and bring warmth back to his body. He looked to the blind old woman who seemed to be watching them.
Who is he?
Ivan asked her, as she moved to stand at his side.
Ah, he is special.
she said with a faint smile.
He is the only one to escape. He is destined to hold the light of the northern fires in his hands.
She looked at Ivan sharply.
He and he alone has escaped.
Escaped what?
Ivan asked, afraid the church and its thugs would be hunting the Purton and coming in force against him. He ignored the rest, not so worried about what the young man might or might not hold in his hands in time.
Death,
She said.
he will die without your aid.
She still looked at Ivan with unblinking blind eyes.
My aid?
Ivan shook his head.
I have no aid they are not giving.
Aid him.
She demanded. He saw lightning flicker in her eyes, and for a moment her eyes went utterly black as oil. Her voice reverberated deeply into almost the growl of an aged bear.
Now!
Ivan did not want to admit it, but he knew the voice of his God when he heard it. He shuddered, knowing once he did this, he would never be able to undo it. To do this was to accept and announce to the powers of the world who he was, if they knew what to look for anyway. Ivan moved. He pushed two men aside to kneel at the boy's side. He drew together hands that felt tiny in his and brought them to his mouth. He almost started to weep, remembering other small sets of hands, those of his children, hands that had hidden in his own. He swallowed the memories and focused on what he was about to do. He had not used such personal magic since the day he had left Azir. He had to push away all thought and emotion to reach into himself for the power to lend aid to the freezing young man. Drawing a deep breath, he sank all his awareness into the core of his chest, to the place inside him that housed a great bear. All things slowed, all emotions and sensation left him, as power rose up, filling his lungs until he blew heat into the boy's hands. The warmth spread down the lean arms. It was as obvious as the change of color of his skin. When it reached the boy's lungs, he drew a great deep breath, but it was not the bitter cold air of the winter in Azir that filled him. It was the energy of Ivan's soul. For a moment, Ivan thought the boy would pass out at the rush of energy. The small hands in his gripped tightly as the adolescent blinked away the head rush and regained consciousness. The other men looked at Ivan with a bit of awe. The old woman draped one of Ivan's furs about the Purton's shoulders as he looked up at Ivan.
It's all right,
The man holding the boy said with a reassuring tone. The boy glanced up, calmed a little at the sight of the man he clearly knew. Ivan rose to his feet.
There is heat and a bed inside.
Ivan said.
The rest of you warm yourselves, eat.
He led the way to his little brew, allowing the other men to do whatever they would. Several followed Ivan inside. They laid the young man on the bed, tucking him in as if he was a prince. Ivan stood back by the hearth and watched them. When the boy had been tucked in, and the others were assured he'd be all right, they left one man at the bedside while the leader turned to Ivan. He pulled off his hood and unwound his scarves to show he was an old man. His hair had all turned white, the braids falling out from being long in his hood. His beard was knotted and fell to his mid-chest. His face held the lines of a man who has seen a lot and lived a very long time. Steel gray eyes looked at Ivan with a sternness that Ivan found both intriguing and insulting. From outside, a man brought in several folding hunting chairs made of yew wood and leather. They were carved as fine as any Ivan had seen, and all of them with the bear motif. The chairs were quickly set up about the small room. Another man had a table, and a woman had a heavy pack of what Ivan expected would be goods, such as ale, jerky, and other travel supplies. Such a pack meant more had arrived. His yard was going to be very full.
I thought I knew all men of the hills,
The old man said, almost accusing Ivan of something. He pulled off his gloves to show his hands wore rings of power, heavy gold, silver, and set stones. Whoever he was, this man held rank, and not in any of the houses of Jerome, but of Azir.
I have been gone, but I am back to the hills of my clan. I was unaware I had to announce myself.
Every member of the clan of these hills is known and accounted for,
The old man said, taking a step forward. He was worn, tired, and trying to hide it. He was a commander and did not trust the presence of a man unknown to him.
Clearly not all.
Ivan said, not about to back down on this. This was his home, his land, and no chieftain, no matter how old, was going to get him to back down. The old seer entered the dwelling with the aid of a woman who gave her a chair to sit in. She kept her eyes closed as she sat, and the old man glanced at her only briefly.
It would save us all time if you just told the truth,
The old man said.
Where are you from and who are you?
Bullen,
The old woman scolded.
enough!
He shot her a cold look, but his eyes went back to Ivan without any move to relent.
You have brought black storms on your back.
Ivan told the old man with a firm tone and a bit of his anger coming out.
It is you who stand in trial, not I. If she belongs to you, then when you go, take her with you,
He said, pointing at the woman. Ivan moved to duck back outside.
By the breath and blood of the bear I shall go as I please,
She said sharply to Ivan. To an Aziran of old, she had clearly announced herself as daughter of the king. He almost turned to roar at her for the blasphemy. All of his children were dead. He grit his teeth and left his own house to sleep with his sheep. Ivan threw himself down into the grass bed with his animals, wrestling with the way the night was going. It was one thing for her to seem a seer, another to claim to be of the breath and blood of the bear. He, of all men, knew his children had all been taken away from him. Then again, he had seen her eyes. He had seen the power of the vastness of creation in them. He pulled Via close to him and tried to block out the noise of the men at his fire, eating his meat. Ivan didn't sleep. He just lay still, trying to block it all out, until someone walked over. He opened his eyes as Via lifted her head. It was a woman. She was as Eziran as any and clearly a warrior, young but strong. She sank down behind him, putting her knee to the ground in a motion of honor and respect.
It is your fire, yet you do not join us?
She said softly to him.
Rarely do we meet another kinsman with the heart of Ezir and not know them. Come, join us, and let us meet you.
He looked at her a long moment before he sat up.
I dwell alone out here for a reason,
He said, but he couldn't help not moving to look at her more closely. It had been years since he had seen a woman, let alone have one so close to him.
Many leave the cities, travel out to the wilds to find their souls, to find our gods, but few live long.
She dared to reach out and touch his coat. She let her fingertips dig into the deep, thick fur. She lifted her gaze to him.
You're not a runaway city boy, though, are you?
She met his eyes, seeking the truth he hid.
Join us. We have sweet ale, candied liver, stories and songs. The men wish you to come and be with us. They do not wish to wake a slumbering bear into a sour mood, but invite you into our company.
He almost laughed at that. It was rude to wake a bear from his den with loud noise and careless steps. Let him wake on his own was a good rule that was taught to all children. He didn't feel like getting up at all, but she offered her hand. He looked at the door to his own house, to the fire, and back to her. He relented and took her hand, letting her help him to his feet. He had a few questions, and she was going to answer them.